Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. I've been reliably informed that it's December and busy times, end of year. This year's over, apparently. Actually, probably by the time we put these videos out.
It will be much closer to that, yeah.
Yeah, will we get them out in December? I'm not actually sure. We might actually achieve it.
Yeah. Balin, your Christmas is cancelled. You're having to come in and edit this.
Yeah, get it. We need it done in December because I've now told everyone they'll be watching this in December.
All right.
So, Q&A, part 1, in December. But before we do any of that, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Gigabyte and their new range of X870 and Z890 motherboards, powering the latest AMD and Intel processors. Gigabyte Z890 range supports Intel's new Core Ultra processors, while the X870 range supports AMD's Ryzen 9000 series, including the gaming flagship Ryzen 7 9800X3D. All models offer robust power delivery with optimal cooling, screwless M.2 storage, and AI-powered overclocking software to ensure you get the most out of your CPU. The stacked I/O offers various connectivity options, including Wi-Fi 7, up to 10 gigabit LAN, Thunderbolt 4, and plenty of USB ports. Now, a new feature of the AI top models is the included utility that allows you to train your own AI models at home or for small/large scale businesses. Finally, Gigabyte's X870 and Z890 range are available now from your favorite online retailers, and until December 31st, you can score a bonus Gen 4 1TB SSD when purchasing select models. So for more information, please check the links in the video description. All right, Tim, with the success of the B580 and hopefully the B570, which should be coming up pretty shortly, do you think we'll be getting some higher end and competitively priced Battlemage GPUs? That'd be exciting. If so, when do you think this will be, and what do you expect them to try and compete with? So
I've made a couple of notes here related to this question because there have been some rumors about other ARC Battlemage, at least the GPU dies. So the B580 and the B570, they use the BMG G21 GPU die. So that has 20 Xe cores in it. And there have been rumors of other GPU dies from this series. I think there's a lower end model as well. Not sure if we'll see that. But there's the rumors of what's supposedly called the BMG G31 GPU die. So that's a higher tier die with supposedly 32 Xe cores. Now, I've got no idea whether this is true or not. This is just based on rumors and speculation and that sort of thing. But I guess there's a chance that you would see a higher tier Battlemage card based on the fact that there's rumors of that GPU die. So I guess if we're talking about 32 Xe cores, that would be 60% more cores than what we're getting with the G21 die. So if we had perfect scaling of core increase to performance increase over the B580, you'd end up with a GPU that sits in between an RTX 4070 and 4070 Super in performance. So, if we sort of take a conservative approach, maybe say that's 4070 in performance, and it was sold for, let's say, $400 US, that would be 60% more cost than the B580. So, scale and price, and that would be about 20% less than the 4070. So, that's sort of similar value, I guess, to what the B580 is providing relative to the 4060. So, with all of that in mind, that would be borderline good compared to today's GPUs, right? Like where the 4070 is priced, 4070 Super in that $500 to $600 range. But we're just about to get new GPUs, right, from Nvidia, probably in that sort of pricing performance tier. Certainly, maybe not initially in January, but within the next couple of months after that, we'd be expecting an RTX 5070. So if that Nvidia card offered another 20% better value, just as a random guess, making it more like a 4070 Ti or whatever, then Intel would need to cut their prices again by like another 20%. Pretty short after the release or around the release of the product. And that would mean that this $400 GPU that we're talking about relative to today's market has to become more like $320. And then you're talking about, I guess, like a fairly large GPU die and a fairly expensive product to produce, where Intel may only be able to sell it for $320, $350 at most US, which I don't know if that's possible. I guess with the B580, they've got this advantage where they can release the product priced against the current market because we're probably not going to see a 4060 successor within the next couple of months. So they've got a window there where they can sell that product. with a future GPU that's higher tier, there's kind of a time crunch to get that out before they have to start competing with next-gen products. So based on that sort of brief analysis, I'm sort of tossing up, it could go either way. Like, it sounds like they might have produced the GPU die, the GPU core, but whether or not they actually make the product and then can make the product based on the cost of it and the value and where it needs to be priced, I've got no idea. So I could really see it going either way. Either they release what they've potentially made, or they decide they can't get the pricing, the value equation into a position where it makes sense to launch. So who knows on that one? I hope they do. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Like, would you hope that they would make a product anyway?
Well, yeah, I hope they do. But yeah, obviously how feasible it is, hard to say. It seems based on, all the time, everything you've discussed, that they probably wouldn't release it. But again, I hope they do, because they'd be forced into making a good value product, and that's what we want. But how beneficial that would be for Intel, yeah, difficult to say.
They certainly left the door open for it by naming the current card that they've got the B580, even though it is still faster than an A770. They could have called it a B770 or something and gone about it pretending that it was a high-end GPU as part of their lineup, but they've left that option open. So I guess if it turns out that Nvidia and AMD GPUs aren't as competitive, then maybe they'll decide, yeah, let's release that product. If it turns out those GPUs are especially good in terms of price performance, they may decide they can't compete in that price range. So yeah, it's obviously a work in progress with these Battlemage GPUs, but they're targeting the sort of price points where they think they are going to have the most success. And I think the B580 is heading that way.
Yep.
Do you actually think the B580 and any potential future Battlemage GPUs are going to cause concern for AMD and Nvidia? Do you think it will cause them to lower prices to compete, or do you think next-gen GPUs will be business as usual, i.e. disappointing value?
Well, yeah, Battlemage isn't going to change anything that AMD and Nvidia do at this point in time. It's probably always going to be, I think back when Alchemist first came out, I said it would be about 5 generations before they had a chance to actually do that. And that was based on if things continue to track the way they are. So I guess they're on track to do that for the time frame that I gave, but they're still multiple generations away from being able to put real pressure on AMD and Nvidia, especially across the product stack, or at least to sort of the mid-range to high-end, but obviously not the extreme high-end, because even AMD has trouble with that. So for this generation, it'll be more business as usual. What that looks like is hard to say. I think Nvidia do need, well, depending on how, there's a lot of factors, I guess, like how aggressively they want to push gaming GPUs. But if they actually want to sell gaming GPUs, they do have to offer something more compelling, especially when we're talking about the entry-level to mid-range products. VRAM's become a hot topic for obvious reasons. So they need to, I think releasing another, especially $400 US GPU with only 8 gigabytes of VRAM, I just can't see that flying at all. It's
not going to sell.
I don't see how that works out for them. I know there's rumors of certain models with certain VRAM configurations. We'll have to wait and see what they actually do there. But based on just what we've seen with the 4060 Ti, the 8 gigabyte sales versus the 16 gigabyte sales, it should be very clear to Nvidia that they can't do that. Like it's not going to be a popular product.
Well, if they did it again, like the 4060 Ti was basically a 3060 Ti in performance. So it wasn't even just the VRAM issue. It was like the price to performance ratio did not improve either.
Yeah, they might be able to fix that aspect of it, but the VRAM's the VRAM.
Yeah,
so yeah, we'll see what happens there. But yeah, so far Intel's not putting any significant pressure on them. Obviously, there's a volume issue as well at this point in time. So the B580 looks great. It's a good value product in the current market at the current price. Unfortunately, you can't currently buy it, so that makes it a bit challenging. But yeah, it's the entry level where they've applied they could be applying a little bit of pressure, but again, availability and all that.
Yeah, I think Nvidia's probably not going to be troubled by this too much. I say that because I don't think they're being troubled by AMD too much. Like if there was any sort of pressure that AMD was applying, they would have released maybe like a $200 or $250 GPU in the 40 series because the RX 6600 was pretty much the go-to choice in that sort of price range. Nvidia didn't really seem to be all that bothered by the presence of that GPU. They just had the 4060 at $300 and went with that. So Intel launching a card in that sub $300 price range, I don't think Nvidia is going to even be concerned whatsoever because they're the dominant player, right? Like they can do what they want.
Yep.
It's more, is it going to affect AMD? And I think AMD should be a little concerned that Intel can just come out and create a $250 GPU in their second generation that gets good reviews. That should be maybe not a huge alarm bell, but maybe like a tiny little one on a desk somewhere that's ringing. But they're in a, obviously it's still a better position in terms of sales and perception. People are probably still going to prefer to buy a Radeon card over an Intel Arc GPU in a lower price tier if it was competitive. So based on that, they'll still be trying to, use their reputation, use their drivers that are more broadly working across a large number of games to sell GPUs, at least for now. So, I would hope that AMD and Nvidia would come out with really compelling mid-range, lower-tier GPUs and have that response to Intel to make them, much better than they currently are. But I don't think it'll be due to Intel that would happen. It will be due to Nvidia trying to convince previous Nvidia owners to upgrade from a 2060 or a 3060 to a new 50 series product. It'll be AMD trying to do the same thing, trying to convert people from Nvidia. I think the presence of the B580, that'll just be simmering in the sort of the background.
Some people have claimed that Intel is losing a lot of money on the B580 at $250, given it's decently sized on the 5nm process, and that they are manufacturing as little as possible to minimize losses. How likely do you guys think this is, and what are your thoughts if true?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Intel is selling the GPU at a loss in terms of the manufacturing costs of the card. I don't think it's a situation where it's costing them, let's say, $270 to make the card, and then they're selling it for $250. That seems very unlikely. I know 5nm is an expensive process and all that sort of thing. It still isn't costing them $250 to manufacture a 270 square millimeter die. That would be outrageous. And yeah, an interview with Tom Peterson from Intel that's over on our podcast channel. They're saying Intel is saying things like, we're not making money on the Arc division at the moment, but I think that's more down to the overall cost of everything associated with the Arc division. So that includes like research and development costs, which are very expensive. So those are things that you'd factor into the profitability of like an Nvidia card or a Radeon card, right? Like, it's cost them $1 billion to design that architecture or whatever, so you have to factor that into the card. I think with Intel, they're probably losing money on the division because of the research and development costs, but on a per card basis, I don't think they're selling them at a loss. I think it's just there's not that much supply of them and they're in demand, so that's why you don't see too many of them at the moment.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of questions around this, but really, as I've said, whenever I discuss this, I just think it's too early. I think a lot of people that are making claims on this, especially those that are pretty confident in their claims, they don't actually know for sure. It's a hunch or a feeling or what they want the situation to be. Look, they may end up being right, but it's more guesswork at this point in time. I know you can ask around at retailers, see what their supply's like and things like that. But I think it's far too early to really make those calls on the B580 just yet. We see it all the time. Like, I know parts like the 9800X 3D, so the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, very popular. I know a lot of people have been buying those. You still can't really buy them, and it's about 2 months now. We're coming up to 2 months, so after release, and you still can't just go buy one at most retailers, and that's the case in Australia, US.
Yeah.
And what's the conclusion? They're not making that many of them because they don't want to sell them, or they're not really that popular, or that you can draw all these random conclusions, but really it's just guesswork. So give it a few months, see what availability's like, how well they're still selling. But from everyone we've spoken to, the supply seems reasonable. It's more the demand that's caught everyone off guard. So
yeah, I think that's the main thing that's happening with this launch. It's not a case of where they've looked at me like, we shouldn't be making too many of these GPUs. I think that the reason the supply is what it is that, you think about how many A770s did Intel sell? The answer is not very many. It was not a very popular GPU. And so, yeah, the things that you've spoken to retailers about, and we just see from the sentiment in comments on the announcement video for the B580, your review of the B580, the interest in that review, like the views, that sort of reception relative to Alchemist GPU reviews and that sort of thing. I think it's been surprising how much interest there's been in the product. So if Intel sort of internally going, oh, this is how many people are interested in the A770, this is how many people we're predicting are going to be interested in the B series, they're going to produce a number of GPUs relative to that. They're going to try and guess that. They don't want to overproduce cards because then you have to sell them at a loss and fire sale them and all that sort of thing. So they tried to predict that. And I think in most areas, I think the reception has exceeded those expectations, which has caused this lack of supply, this too much demand, not enough supply. It's exactly what you get. I don't think it's a situation where they haven't made cards because they're selling them at a loss. They just didn't anticipate this much demand. They didn't expect to have a card that was as compelling as it was. And it seems to even be compelling in places where it's a little more expensive, where it's priced a little bit higher, more in the realm of the Radeon and Nvidia cards, which is the case here, isn't it?
It's similar price to an RTX 4060. I think it's still selling really well though because of the VRAM. So to get more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, you have to spend considerably more money than a B580. So I believe that's a contributing factor. But as I was saying, there's so much unknown about a lot of these things at this point in time. And one thing that I know for a fact that all of the people making these comments don't know is how much profit Intel's making. Like they just don't know. Yeah. So anyone who tells you they're making a $20 loss, I hate to say they're full of it. They just don't know. There's nobody who knows that information outside of select people within Intel. And they're not going to be just leaking that information out willy-nilly for no reason to leakers or whatever. So people don't know what the profit margins are on these cards, whether they're losing money or not. That stuff is pretty well fabricated at this point. Again, it's hunches, beliefs, whatever. But I don't think there's any evidence that anyone has that they can point to say, look, I'm right, this is where they're losing the money or whatever.
Well, I mean, most leaks come through AIBs, and AIBs don't know the profitability of the GPU die. Like, they're just told the price that Intel wants for it and how much margin they will be making on their AIB cards. That information is deep within Intel. Like, not many people would be fully aware of that. So, yeah, I think it's unlikely that information, if there is that information out there, that it's accurate. And
I think if you are making those claims as well, especially if we were to make those claims, you really do need to provide evidence to support those claims. You can't just say, trust me, or I heard this from someone.
You need some numbers.
You need some sort of evidence to make those claims, at least for someone to take them seriously. So that's why I don't take any of those claims seriously, because I've seen no evidence to support them at all.
I think it doesn't even make any logical sense either that the cards would be selling at a loss, because if you think about or at least they haven't made enough of them because it's selling at a loss. Because if you think about why would they release the product, right? If they're selling the product at a loss and they've decided to price it at that price and sell it at a loss, the reason would be to invest in your GPU brand, to build market share so that at some point in the future, you would be making a profit. So the thinking would be, let's invest now, get people interested in Arc, and it will pay off at some point in the future, which means you wouldn't want to make no cards. You'd want to make as many as you can because that's the whole play. You're getting people interested so that it pays off in the future. If you're not making money and not making any, there's no point releasing the product. There's no play there. There's no payoff in the future. It's, I guess, just to say you launched a product for some bizarre metric. Like, what would the reason be? I think that the more likely scenario, and again, this is just speculation, I don't actually know. The more likely scenario is they are going for a market share play. They're making a small profit, but not anywhere near as much of a profit as AMD or Nvidia make. And AMD and Nvidia, they make a significant profit margin on the cost of making the hardware. Like, it's not like 10%. They're making big numbers. So I think they're making a small profit on the B580, and the goal is to make people interested in Arc, gain market share, not necessarily at a loss, but at as slim of a margin as they can get away with. So yeah, that's what I think is the most likely explanation. And yeah, we'll have to wait and see in terms of if there's any other evidence that comes out that suggests they're coming at a loss, then I guess we'll change our mind on that one. But as you said, there's no hard evidence I've seen for that.
Or any evidence.
Well, any evidence at all, actually.
What do you think about SteamOS becoming a replacement for Windows for those wanting a console-like experience with PC performance? So,
I am genuinely interested in your thoughts about this because I like the idea of a competitor to Windows for PC gaming.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that the reason why we haven't gotten a competitor to Windows is that Windows brings game compatibility. You can run your huge library of games in as many configurations as you like, and it tends to, not always, but it tends to just work and play games. If you're trying to run games on other operating systems, whether that's like Mac OS, Linux distributions, or whatever, historically it's been very fiddly. There's been very few games that natively support the games at all, so you have to use emulation layers, and generally that emulation has been very bad. It just hasn't worked, or at least comes with a quite sizable performance implication or whatever, right? But now with SteamOS and the Steam Deck, they've kind of solved a lot of those issues. The emulation has gotten a lot better. You can run games at a much more decent experience, and the performance loss, at times, is not even a performance loss at all. So if they could execute that, that would make a genuine competitor to Windows. So would you use something like that that's like a gaming-focused operating system?
Yeah, I definitely would. I'd be more inclined to use it now opposed to a few years ago, given how clunky and bad Windows continues to get with every release.
Yeah.
So I've continued, or I like Windows less and less as time goes by. It just becomes more difficult to use in the sense that they've tried to simplify things, but it's just a mess. Stuff doesn't work the way it should. Functionality that you did want then gets removed, and then you have to use third-party applications to try and add it back. But that, again, is clunky and continues to get broken, so that's just annoying. And then all the performance-related issues, really performance and compatibility, probably throw stability in there as well. All the bad kind of issues that you don't want your operating system to have seems to be stuff that Windows has these days. So it's just become a pain. It's become a pain to use, and especially when it comes to testing, it's become a nightmare. Performance is just all over the place now. It's really hard to get accurate data with Windows. We saw like the crazy difference between 23H2 to 24H2 with Ryzen processors. So it sucks to use basically. So
I think 24H2 has probably been one of the worst updates.
Well,
in terms of 23H2 and 24H2 have had a lot of problems.
Yes. Yeah. 24H2 is great in the sense that it fixed the Ryzen performance and some other performance related issues, but then to be fair, it did create performance issues for like 12th gen. A lot of Intel processors actually ran worse on it. So it was like the Ryzen fix that somehow managed to break Intel CPUs in the process. And then a lot of applications and things don't work properly on it. So it's a bit of a mess. I mean, I personally, through my testing of stuff, I haven't had too many issues with it. It's been pretty flawless, my experience on my personal PC and the test systems. Really, the only annoyance on the test systems has been the regression that we've seen for, I think it was like 12th gen. I think I tried 10th gen. That was a bit slower as well. And then obviously Arrow Lake had a heap of problems, but not sure if you include those because Arrow Lake has a heap of other problems. And I think the 24H2 problems have probably been largely addressed now for Arrow Lake. But it's been anything but smooth sailing. So I guess, yeah, if we had an alternative that was much more simplified, worked as it should, performance was what it should be, easily, well, I don't know, it was just consistent, let's say, that would be something that I would definitely be interested in using.
I think there's a few hurdles that Steam has to get over before something like SteamOS would be suitable for at least desktop users. It makes sense for a handheld because it's a gaming device.
You'd want some basic functionality.
So I think, for something like a desktop experience, a lot of people use Windows not just for gaming. There's a lot of other applications. So either you'd need to support those in the OS that you're making, or make it really easy to switch between Windows and SteamOS for gaming. I think it's probably becoming easy with how quickly systems can boot now.
Mm-hmm.
So in the old days, you'd load up Windows and you just let your computer sleep because it takes so long to boot Windows. You really don't want to be changing the operating system you're booting into. But it's probably a little easier to do that now. It's still obviously complicated to dual boot operating systems, so it's not ideal, but there would be a path to making that a bit more user-friendly. But then there's also the whole thing of, well, what about people who have bought games outside of Steam, like on the Epic Game Store, Ubisoft, whatever, Microsoft Game Pass, all those sort of places that people also access games on Windows? How would that go in a SteamOS setting where they may try and lock you down into using Steam as your game distribution platform, which I know most people use, but it's the PC platform, it's open, you've got all these other options. So to make something like SteamOS a success, they'd probably have to figure out those two things. So quickly booting into it so that you could use it legitimately on your gaming PC, and figuring out what happens with games that are not purchased through Steam. If they can solve those two things, then yeah, it could be a viable contender to Windows, because I'd be perfectly fine on my system. I'd be doing some video editing or whatever, pressing a button takes maybe 20, 30 seconds to close Windows, open SteamOS, ready for gaming. That sounds like an experience that would be reasonable, especially if SteamOS is bringing benefits like you say, more consistent performance. Some native Linux games outperform Windows games. So it's kind of like you may actually be getting better performance by running in that more gaming-focused operating system.
Yeah, I mean, you almost certainly will get better performance in a lot of examples, I would think.
Yeah, and then just like less bloat, less crap running in the background, no, RGB utilities just conflicting with your game so that they don't run well, or, performance issues and that sort of thing. That sounds appealing to me, but we'll see how they go with that. Obviously, the first step is opening up SteamOS so that it can be installed on other devices. So if they can nail that sort of thing, then there's a path to Windows competition.
All right, Tim, ray tracing.
Cool.
What's your opinion on path tracing in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle? It definitely looks like a transformative use of the technology, but the performance hit is substantial. Do you think partially or fully enabling path tracing is worth the performance hit or compromising on other visual settings?
Yeah, so I played a bit of this game now, quite a bit, probably 2/3 of the way through at this point, and I played the majority of that with path tracing enabled. I have a 4090, so it's kind of, this isn't going to be an experience I would necessarily recommend to everyone. So caveat on that, it's probably not going to run on your 4060.
Yeah, you non-4090 peasants.
The thing I found most impressive, I guess, with path tracing in this game is that it actually probably runs the best of the path tracing examples in terms of its performance. So with like Cyberpunk, Black Myth Wukong, those sorts of games, path tracing is generally a below 60 FPS experience, at least for the configuration I use. I've got an ultra-wide monitor, and if I'm playing without frame generation, maybe with a little bit of DLSS, pretty common for that to be 60 FPS or below in those games. With Indiana Jones, quite a substantial portion of the game I've been playing up around 80 or 90 FPS with DLSS quality and no frame generation, which for that sort of game is quite playable. It certainly doesn't feel particularly bad to play. There are some areas where performance is lower, more around 60 FPS, but it's never been dipping into 50, 40 FPS. And again, this is my specific experience. If you're playing at 4K, for example, 60 FPS is probably going to be hard to achieve without serious levels of upscaling. But the fact that I can play at least this game with path tracing at frame rates we've set are acceptable for single player titles, I think is a win for path tracing, especially because it does look quite a bit better. So if that is sort of a baseline for what we can expect for more path tracing games, where you can actually get into a configuration where you don't have to rely on frame generation, because it is a first-person game. I find frame generation in first-person games to not feel particularly great. Indiana Jones is no exception. I turned frame gen on. I was like, just the mouse movements with the first-person perspective, it feels a little rubber bandy, which you don't get as much of in a third-person game. So I prefer to play without frame gen on for this game. But yeah, like the performance has been fine with it on. And the good news as well is that there's options in the game where you can change the amount of path tracing. It's not just an on-off toggle like you'd see in Cyberpunk. You can configure it for reflections, for global illumination and shadows separately. So you could choose the benefits that you want to get there. And yeah, I mean, the visuals I found, I saw on Twitter someone saying, oh, you can actually keybind the ray tracing settings to key presses, so you can quickly turn on and off path tracing.
Okay.
So I was going through the game, I'm like, I was just interested. How much of a benefit are you actually getting? Because sometimes you go into a game, you have to change the settings. You kind of forget what you were just seeing a little bit. You turn it on, you're like, is this making a difference? Well, I've got a key press, I can just press it. It instantly changes. And in a lot of scenes, it does noticeably change how the game looks and makes it look substantially better. So if you're a high-end GPU owner, I would say probably play with path tracing on. I think the performance, you'll be pleasantly surprised considering it is path tracing. Because when you're not using path tracing, it runs at like 180 FPS or something, which you probably don't need for this sort of game. The engine is quite well optimized in that sense. But on those higher end cards, yeah, I'd say probably experiment with some of those settings just to see what it can do. Because yeah, it looks pretty good. And I think that should really be setting the baseline of what to expect from these high tier ray tracing experiences. It's a game where it actually makes a difference, unlike a lot of games where the performance it is there, but it's not totally unplayable in realistic settings on a high end GPU. It's not the worst experience, I'd say. So that's my sort of analysis of Indiana Jones. Good game.
So you'd have to do a bit of tweaking and tuning and working out to see to what GPU that applies. Like RTX 4070, can you do it? Is it too compromised? So 12 gigabytes of VRAM not enough?
Well, I think the game itself already uses quite a bit of VRAM without enabling those high tier settings. Like 12 gigabytes is kind of on the edge as it is, especially at the higher resolutions. Certainly on 8 gigabytes, I think Digital Foundry was showing you had to not just turn down the texture settings, but turn down like the shadow settings and stuff, because those are also impacting VRAM. So with a 12 gigabyte card there, path tracing is probably not an option, but on a 4070 Ti Super and that sort of card, that's probably around where path tracing, depending on the resolution you're playing at, of course, where it may make sense to use.
So that really strongly supports what we've been saying and a lot of other people at this point in time, that really for a mid-range graphics card, 16 gigabytes now is the minimum.
Yeah, especially if you're more inclined to use something like frame generation.
Well, if you're buying an RTX, a GeForce graphics card, if you're paying a premium for the GeForce product over a Radeon product or perhaps an Arc product, the assumption is there that you want to use all of those features, and that's therefore why you're paying the premium. It's not the only reason, but it's a big contributing factor for why you would pay that premium.
Yes.
So if you can only use a smaller portion of the features, then that's what we've been talking about. Like RTX 4060 really makes no sense because of all the premium features that you would pay for to get a GeForce GPU. Essentially, none of them are beneficial on an RTX 4060. 4060 Ti is sort of the same case. And then the 4070 is where, you got a bit more VRAM, more processing power. So you're probably targeting 1440p or higher. So, DLSS quality and stuff like that becomes a key feature. So, yeah. But then if we're talking about next generation games, on next generation GPUs, but they only have a 12 gigabyte frame buffer, for example, then how useful is all that sort of stuff? Anyway, it's food for thought. Obviously, we have to wait and see what the next generation brings and how they're configured. But it's certainly suggesting now that if you're spending a reasonable amount of money on a GPU, you're going to want 16 gigabytes of VRAM as the minimum.
I think this game in particular is a really good example of something that's future looking, because it requires ray tracing, so there's no non-ray traced option. It doesn't load on cards without ray tracing hardware. So I'm not actually sure whether turning on path tracing increases the VRAM requirements compared to ray tracing, just the normal ray tracing mode. But the fact that it is a ray trace game and most realistic configurations are using 10 to 12 gigabytes of VRAM, even for 1080p sort of gaming. And we know ray tracing increases VRAM usage. So if you're making a game where it only does ray tracing, you can expect the VRAM requirements the baseline VRAM requirement is going to be a bit higher than you'd see from other titles. And that's certainly the case in this game.
Yeah, it'll jump up again if you want to use frame generation, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So if we're looking and sort of saying, yeah, it's a good example of ray tracing and path tracing, which I think is definitely true, and that the performance side of things for high-end GPU owners is nice, where's that where's that minimum level that you can start to use path tracing? Like, I appreciate that it's got different settings you can configure path tracing, different to a Cyberpunk where you kind of turn it on and it's like, "Ooh, is it going to work? Is it not going to work?" There's at least a little bit of manipulation you can do there. But yeah, like for some models, it's not going to be necessarily the ray tracing performance of the GPU as to whether you can run path tracing, but more like the VRAM as well. So yeah, I would imagine that, the 4070 Ti Super is probably the minimum for something like path tracing. But there's games like Cyberpunk where that would be the case from a performance standpoint as well, not just the VRAM side of things. So yeah, but I kind of see this game. You know how we've been talking a lot about 8 gigabytes of VRAM. There were warning signs, right? Like, there's examples now where games using more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, it's going to be a problem for more titles in the future. I think games like Indiana Jones show that as well for ray tracing to some extent. Like, we're now getting games where ray tracing is required, and VRAM plays into that, where path tracing is included. So there's going to be this point in the future where if more games start only doing ray tracing, you're probably going to want a card, especially for mid-range gamers, that does a reasonable level of ray tracing to get this sort of experience. That said, apparently the game runs really well on most hardware without path tracing enabled. So they've done a good job of the ray tracing, but you know what I mean, right? Like,
the difference with the ray tracing, I agree with what you're saying. The only difference there being that the GPUs you have now, and this has always been an argument that we've seen made time and time again, happen a lot with the GeForce 20 series, is that they're future-proofer. They support ray tracing, therefore future titles, but the ray tracing component, the compute throughput, the processing power of that GPU doesn't improve. So generally for ray tracing to become more transformative and look better, they have to do more ray tracing. And therefore it requires more processing power. Older GPUs get completely crippled to the point where they don't work, which is why parts like, the RTX 2060, 2070, 2070 Super and so on, even up to the 2080, didn't age very well. Like, by the time we got I don't want to say a lot, we got more good examples of games where turning ray tracing on made a difference. Those GPUs, or most of those GPUs I just mentioned, couldn't run at all. Partially sometimes because of VRAM, but also because of the processing power. Where on the VRAM side of things, even if you have like an RX 6600, maybe not ray tracing mandatory games, because that's not a particularly great ray tracing GPU, but games that have large texture packs, high quality visuals, although you might not have the processing power to run that game on ultra, you can put it on medium and you can crank the texture quality right up, which still really enhances the overall presentation of the game. And that can be enjoyed on an older GPU. So in a sense, the VRAM was future-proof. It helped.
Yeah, because it allows you to use, as games increase the textures, you can start using more of that.
Which the opposite is true with ray tracing.
Yeah, I think that where I was coming from more with the ray tracing example is less it will age better. The GPU you have will age better over time for ray tracing, because that won't happen. It's more if you were choosing a GPU and one GPU was substantially better at ray tracing than the other GPU, I think that will become more relevant as time goes on, because you'll be getting cards
this
that do
speaks to
more
what
ray tracing.
Again, you're right, but you're also wrong. It applies to 4090 owners. Doesn't apply to 47 owners, 4060.
Well, it applies to a 4070 owner if the game only does ray tracing, because the rasterization performance is not as relevant there, because the game doesn't even use it.
Sure.
So I guess what I'm saying is, like, if there's more games in the future that only do ray tracing and that the number increases, then the cards that are better at ray tracing are going to get better over time. Not better in their FPS performance, but relative to the other cards.
I see what you're saying. It just depends. Like, it might be a situation where technically it is better than the competing part of the time, but you have to run the game on such low quality settings for it to actually work. Because if you take one of the first generation ray tracing GPUs to play Indiana Jones, you probably have to play on like the lowest possible presets, right?
Probably.
So
I think with 8 gigabytes of VRAM you do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, it's a bit more messy as to how good the experience, how heavily compromised the experience will be.
Well, I think it does depend on how the game is implementing ray tracing. I think for I don't know how many games this will apply to in the next generation. I think most games will still have a rasterized mode and a ray trace mode. I think that'll be the most common configuration. And I guess we have seen in a lot of these ray tracing only games, they actually do run reasonably well across the stack. Like Star Wars Outlaws, you can play that on relatively low GPUs. And things like Indiana Jones, you can as well.
Again, you have to dial up, like we're talking medium preset for Star Wars Outlaws. Ultra's brutal.
Well, I think on a 4060, you're probably playing most games on dialed down quality settings.
Games, yes.
Well, yes, but like the ray trace, it doesn't, compared to a game like Alan Wake with path tracing off, does Star Wars Outlaws run that much worse than that game? I wouldn't say it's it depends on the GPU, of course, but it's not crippling low-end cards. So I guess it does depend on like where we're expecting ray tracing games to go. Is it going to require high-end GPUs? I think developers probably won't do that because then their games just won't sell because no one will be able to run them. So yeah, I think we're going to see more examples of that ultra setting experience being more playable on a card with better ray tracing performance. That's all I'm sort of saying. So
that's fair.
Whether or not, it depends on a whole bunch of different factors. Because again, like I could sit here and say the obvious thing that we're talking about is Nvidia with better ray tracing performance, AMD with weaker, right? But if Nvidia's offering a 5060 with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, does it matter that its ray tracing performance is much better? Because it's probably going to be crippled by the VRAM. So there's going to be a whole bunch of different factors that play into the aging aspect of these cards. Like how it ages for ray tracing may depend more on the VRAM side of things than on the actual ray tracing performance.
So if I get this right, what you're saying is even if it's $3,000 US, everyone should buy a 5090 because that's a good investment and it will ensure that the ray tracing only games play really well.
I mean,
that's what you're saying, right?
I think it's, what is it? The more you buy, the more you save. So maybe buy a 5090 and then a backup just in case it dies because they might be hard to buy.
Sure. Tim's advocating for buying two 5090s. Honestly, if you could do that on launch, it would probably be a wise investment because you'd probably be able to sell them both for a substantial profit.
You're probably right.
So, I mean, there you go. There's some investing information from Harbour. No, just... Moving on to the next question before I get us into any legal trouble. What is the most overhyped motherboard-related feature? PCIe 5.0 GPU slots on motherboards, overkill VRMs, PCIe 5.0 SSDs, VRM heatsinks. Don't touch the heatsinks. And or fans, or maybe something else. Most overhyped motherboard-related feature. Like, I get the PCIe stuff like that. That can be... I don't know if it's overhyped. It's not the most exciting feature or something that people really hype up. So I don't know if that's it. It's probably, for the most part, unnecessary on consumer boards, the latest PCIe standards, because you can mostly still get away with PCIe 3.0, even for storage, really. So, yeah, but whether it's overhyped, not sure. Again, VRMs, they're definitely leaning or have hit the overkill side of things. But whether they're overhyped, like VRM is very important. It's not something you can change on the board. So if you have an insufficient VRM, that's problematic for multiple reasons, as we've seen in the past when VRMs were typically kind of bad and now they're kind of overkill.
What about RGB lighting?
Do people get hyped? I guess it's a feature like that people really fixate on, or... Because it's got to be an overhyped thing, right? Do people like...
are we talking about overhype from the buyers or from the manufacturers? Because I think manufacturers overhype things like overclocking settings.
Well, they overhype literally everything.
Well, yeah, I guess.
Everything is overhyped by them. I think just things that people fixate on. And I can see VRMs being part of that because it was really problematic for quite some time. We saw a lot of AMD X570 boards get absolutely trashed here. VRMs were up to like the $400 price point, which was insane. But again, I think it's something that's really important because you want a good... It's not something you don't want to worry, like your VRAM, you don't want to worry about your VRM. You want it just to work. You want it to be a case that you can slot any CPU on that motherboard and it runs cool, no dramas at all. So, yeah. But as for what's overhyped... And the thing with motherboards, the worst, well, the good and bad thing about motherboards is, like, people might say that debug LEDs are overhyped because they never have needed to use them before, and people like BuildZoid and even we really like them bang on about how you should get a board with them, but then people might just think they're unnecessary or whatever. And I think they're a very useful tool. It's kind of like I'd rather need them and not really have to use them. Obviously, if you're an overclocker like BuildZoid, extremely useful for knowing what has tripped up or what's caused your problems. But yeah, some people say, I don't want a heap of M.2s on board. I can use expansion cards, or why do I need so many? Then other people like, this board only has 2. That's ridiculous. It should have a minimum of 5. So I think that really speaks to why there's so much product segmentation and so many variations of motherboards covering various different price points, because people like different things. Like, in my opinion, one of the most overhyped things for a long time, but it's sort of a minority. I don't know how you feel overhyped this, but like onboard audio. I think the need for testing onboard audio, because first of all, I haven't used onboard audio on a motherboard for over 10 years. Have you?
I
think you said you use one system, you use it.
I've got a very old analog 5.1 setup, so I still use it on that.
Is it your home theater? Because we had this discussion not that long ago. But anyway, from my point of view, and again, this is a personalized thing. If I used onboard audio all the time, I wouldn't have this opinion, but I don't use it. So on my stream PC, I have a Stream Deck. All my audio is handled through that. Doesn't use the onboard audio. I usually use like a sound DAC or something, because I just prefer the quality of those and find them more reliable than onboard audio.
There's a lot of like HDMI soundbars these days. People use USB headsets.
Well, that's what I use.
3.5mm headsets.
On my main PC, I use a soundbar. Don't use the onboard audio for that.
Bluetooth/wireless headsets are popular as well.
I use a USB wireless headset whenever I'm using one. So again, don't use onboard audio. I don't know if there's a bit of a misconception there. People think when you use a USB headset, you're still using the motherboard's onboard audio. Like, I don't know if...
Do people think that?
No, I don't think that's...
Maybe they think
I certainly think there's some people that possibly think that. But anyway, there are a lot of people, a surprising amount of people, that demand onboard audio testing and are really invested in the quality of... Like, it's an important feature for them, the onboard audio quality.
I've always found it fine. Like,
it depends on the motherboard. There are some that are very bad, like crosstalk's bad, hissing. There can be crackling.
Honestly, I've plugged in my 3.5mm audio jack speakers into a wide variety of motherboards. I've never thought, that is really bad onboard audio. Maybe there's a quality difference, but I'm just not sensitive enough to care.
No. Some boards in the past have been very bad, like kind of broken with it. But I would say the vast majority work just fine.
There was one time I got a motherboard where the onboard audio just did not work at all, but that was an issue with that board, and I just got it replaced, and that worked.
All right, I think my final answer would be the things that are most overhyped on consumer-grade desktop motherboards are toolless features. Like, how often... Like, I kind of, in some ways, appreciate the toolless features on motherboards, because I'm constantly changing SSDs. I'm constantly changing graphics cards. So that is kind of useful for me. It's not game-changing. Historically, I've just ripped off the retention clips anyway, so I can just slot graphics cards in and out. And in fact, that's not even entirely true that they're useful for me, because the press button thing at the end of the board is kind of annoying. Especially when I'm testing, like, you've seen the stack of motherboards. Yeah. It's in a different location, so I've got to, like, it actually takes me longer to find which brand's using what, like, is it a pull mechanism? Is it a push? Where's the push? Whereas,
the tab was always in the same spot.
Previously, the tab was always in the same spot, so I would just push that and pull the graphics card out. So for me, that's not even made life easier. But I'm thinking beyond me to the people who are building the window's going nuts, by the way, right now. So if you guys are hearing a lot of banging and stuff, it's just trees hitting the studio. We'll probably be fine. Anyway, getting back to it, how often do you guys change your graphics cards? Like, is having a tool-free button or ability, like, Asus have the thing where if you grab the card from the front of the slot and pull out, it comes out, which is kind of neat. You've kind of got to know about that as well, because if you grab it from the wrong end, then you can't actually get it out anymore. So... for me, I think those things are probably the most overhyped.
It doesn't save, like, removing the GPU, moving it to a button as opposed to right near the thing, it doesn't save heaps of time. I think the most useful of those toolless things I've seen are the Wi-Fi ones, where instead of having to screw in the little things, it's just more of a plug. Like, that makes more sense. But is that hyped? Like, it shouldn't be overhyped. It's kind of like, oh, cool.
It's yeah,
and that's
it's
right?
a quality thing, but at the same time, there's probably most people that once they screw that thing in once, it's like, well,
yeah, it's in now.
That's screwed in, and probably will be screwed in for the next 3 to 5 years without me having to touch it. So, if it's something that you do once a year, once every 3 years, once every 5 years, and it goes from being a 5-second task to a 3-second task.
Yeah,
but I don't know. I'm not saying that they're bad or they shouldn't do it. I'm just saying I think it's probably. I would point to tool-free stuff or easy, as it's often referred to, release mechanisms as being more overhyped than overkill VRM. I'd rather have an overkill VRM than I would an easy way to remove my graphics card that I don't plan on upgrading for at least the next 2 years.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All right, we're going to hit pause on part 1 of the December Q&A. We will have a part 2 coming up on the channel shortly. Again, Balin's Christmas has been cancelled. He'll be editing part 2 and making sure that you guys get that in December. It's a top priority for us.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there'll be many more good questions that hopefully we'll get good answers. Depends on which one of us answers them, I suppose. I'll let you guys work out what's implied there. But yeah, that's really it. Thanks heaps for watching throughout the year and this video. And that way I can keep Tim employed and fed and testing monitors and doing all the things that, ray tracing. He does a heap of stuff for the channel.
Occasionally, yeah.
Does a heap of stuff occasionally. But yeah, we have the join button, Patreon, heaps of cool stuff there. Tim and I have conversations live where we answer your questions. They're usually a lot of fun. Behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff, exclusive Discord server. Don't know if I mentioned that already. Anyway, check that out if you're interested. If not, that's perfectly fine. I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim. See you in the next one.